This week, we're speaking with a consultant who works with the financial services industry expressly to help them find applications to make better wealth decisions. What are the things that are being done within the industry to help people who give advice to make better wealth decisions so that you, the investor, can make better wealth decisions? We'll be talking about that this week. This is Make Better Wealth Decisions, a podcast about financial blind spots, decision making, and how the reality of higher rates, global tensions, and tariff instability impact your investments. I'm your host, John DeGuy, a portfolio manager with Design Securities in Toronto. This week, we're speaking with Dr. Preet Banerjee. He is a consultant to the wealth management industry, but he's much, much more than that. He's a columnist, an author, a prolific speaker, a public speaker, and a thought leader. I've known Preet for over 15 years. He's consistently been one of the most important commentators in the financial services industry, and it is a pleasure to invite you on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me on.
I want to begin because you've spent years translating complex financial ideas into clear, relatable lessons for Canadians. So from your perspective, what would you say is the single biggest behavioral bias that Canadians are dealing with right now?
Well, I think a trend as of late, since the beginning of my career until now, is that the world of financial services has become much more complex. And so I think a lot of people are faced with choice paralysis. I see a lot of people who don't do anything because they're so afraid of making the not the most optimal choice, that they don't make a choice at all, which may actually be one of the most suboptimal choices when it comes to a lot of things, when it comes to personal finance. So the world is more complex. It's noisier. There's more sources of information, misinformation, disinformation, and the product landscape is much more complex as well. And then you also have areas which are not perfectly captured by oversight, such as the crypto space and meme stock trading and what have you, and quote unquote advice from social media. So it's easy to see how people get stuck into doing nothing because it is paralyzing.
Yeah. And I think that's part of what people who are educators to the public, we do what we can to help demystify things and to give the people the confidence to move forward, or the confidence to find someone to help them so they can move forward. But at any rate, overcoming the paralysis. So I think it's an important thing. It's funny because I've had other guests come on and no one else has mentioned that. And I think it's a really insightful comment. So thank you for that. I wanted to move on to a lot of the consulting work that you do in your day job. You're a consultant to people with regard to behavioral finance questions. That's what you did your PhD in. But in particular, you're looking for commercial applications. Can you give us maybe 2 or 3 examples of what you mean by a commercial application for behavioral finance?
So for a long time, we've paid a lot of lip service to concepts in behavioral finance and behavioral economics, the anchoring effect, overconfidence, and what have you. And people just talk about it with respect to a laundry list of different cognitive biases and how it affects people's behavior, which is great. But then the next step is, well, how do you use that information and put it into practice to hopefully better the outcomes that the investing public achieve? And so the commercial applications are putting that into practice into wealth management processes so that I generally work with people who give advice, so that they are utilizing these concepts to try and increase advice adherence, try to give better advice in general, but ultimately the goal is for better outcomes for the client. So one of the biggest projects I worked on in the industry was a firm came to me and they said, we want to come up with the Myers-Briggs of personal finance. So Myers-Briggs is like a personality test, which is complete garbage. It's been debunked so many times. Right. And the only times it's referenced in academia is to say it doesn't work. But they like the idea of trying to figure out people's money personalities. So there is luckily a lot of research on personality and how to properly assess sort of personality traits. And because there's so much research on that, there's a lot of studies that have linked different personality traits to susceptibility to different cognitive biases. And so we developed this diagnostic tool. It helps identify people's traits. And so I'll give you an example. One of the things that it could identify was when people put a premium on social harmony, which means that they avoid getting into fights and they're not confrontational or adversarial. Well, in an advice-giving relationship, that's actually a very bad thing because they'll never tell you that they're upset, the client, and they'll just ghost you. And the advisor will be wondering, what did I do wrong? Why did they leave? They never said anything was wrong. So by allowing the client and the advisor know that someone signals for this particular trait, it actually gives them permission to bring up when they're not happy with something that's happening, or they have questions, it allows them to be a little bit more respectfully confrontational. And likewise, it allows the advisor to know to dig in deeper because this person is unlikely to tell them when something is wrong. So that can increase the qualitative nature of that relationship. So phase one was coming up with this tool for the client. Phase two was coming up with this version for advisors. And then phase three was then, all right, now that you know this about the client and this about the advisor, what can you now tell us about how to make that relationship better? So that was a multi-year project rolled out in phases, but that's a perfect example of a commercial application.
Great. And I cannot help but think as I listen to you speak that there might be similar things that could be done with law or medicine or accounting, where you think your accountant was doing something wrong, but you don't really feel comfortable confronting him or her. So maybe there are ways. I guess with the advent of AI, what I'm getting at is there may be opportunities for everyone to work better with professionals and people who give advice, so that if they have a personality work where they just don't like confrontation, they can find a safe way of saying, hey, I've got, like Columbo, one more question that you just want to ask, let you get to the bottom of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I'm finding that my work is now veering more into commercial applications of AI into wealth
Yeah.
management. So I'm spending a lot of time there. It's a huge appetite. And what's paradoxical, I think, to many people is that when you use AI, it actually can increase the human component of advice because it frees up, ideally, the service provider from handling the menial tasks so they can focus on the more emotional considerations and spending time with clients. So it sounds like a paradox, but AI can actually make this business a little bit more human.
Okay. So you and I both work as advocates for financial literacy. And I don't think I've asked you before. So when we talk about what we could do to help the general public make better wealth decisions, what sorts of ideas would you put forward in terms of a wish list? If it was up to you, Preet, what would you do specifically, tangibly, to help people to be more empowered so that they can work things through themselves and just understand the concepts that people that work in the business just take for granted?
Well, I think there's a number of things that I would put on that laundry list. I certainly applaud the strategies to introduce it earlier in terms of school. I think a lot of people will say, yeah, but they won't remember when they need it. It's important to be able to know how to make financial decisions in general, because you're not going to remember the minutia of the details, but you understand how to make good decisions in general. That carries forward. I think a lot of research has shown that JIT delivery, just-in-time delivery of financial literacy at the time when someone is facing a particular question is very important. So if we can do more things, and I think we are starting to see that a lot, where someone is coming up to a decision such as getting a mortgage, say, whatever it is, that then they are then prompted with, here's the information that you should take a look at. And what we find is that people do want this information at a certain period of time. When it comes to the social media sort of landscape, exposing people to bite-sized bits of information is good. And when they find something that is of interest to them, they will latch onto it like a dog and they'll look for more information. So instead of, just sort of seeing a few short videos on Instagram or TikTok, when they see something that is relevant to them at the time, then they might go onto YouTube and look for a long form video to really go in depth. So I feel that a lot of people do want information. The trick is, how do we make sure that they're getting it from credible sources? Because now there's so many sources of information. Some of it is good, some of it not so good.
So what would you recommend if a person in fact says, okay, I've seen something on TikTok, I want to do a deep dive. You go to YouTube, you say, show me mortgage renewal, show me whatever, and you're thinking about whatever financial decision that you're now confronted with. It's not the sort of thing that you're going to be doing on an ongoing basis. It's the sort of thing that may only happen once. Like, what do I need to think of? I'm going to say writing a will, but most people's wills get updated 3, 4 times if they're doing things properly. But you do it sporadically. You do it once a decade. It's the sort of thing that you don't really think about for the entire decade. So you're going to think about how you're going to renew your mortgage or write your will or whatever, and you go to YouTube to do some due diligence, such as it is. How do you determine, what would you recommend in terms of people that have what I would call decision hygiene, just in terms of the information they consume and what they can believe and what they should be acting on?
Yeah, great question. And I think this is something that is part of general literacy in general when it comes to being an adult. We talk about financial
Yeah.
literacy, talk about numeracy and what have you. There's social media literacy as well. And I think you have to be able to identify what is the motive of the person providing the information. I'm not saying that all sort of mechanisms of compensation are all necessarily bad, but you need to know, why is this person putting out this information? Are they in the business of selling this information, a product tied to it or something? Are they doing this for ad revenue because they just want more views? So you need to understand what is the mechanism of compensation for the person providing advice. Are they just doing it of their own sort of
Right.
goodwill, which some of them do, but it's few and far between. So
Man,
that's one thing. A second thing is you should sort of war game it. And what I mean by that, this is a strategy that has been long used by consultants, stems from the military during the Cold War. And it's basically whenever you have decided on a particular idea or strategy or decision to make, take a breath and then come at it the next day, for example, and pretend you're the adversary and try to poke holes. Like, how would you, knowing that you perfectly know this person's strategy with the benefit of perfect clarity into what they're going to do, how would you foil them? How would you tackle them as their opponent? And so this idea of being adversarial with your own decision, I think, is very effective when it comes to decision hygiene, because it allows you to poke holes in whatever decision that you've made. And as I think we're going to talk about, when it comes to making decisions and generating confidence, this can be a very effective foil for, I guess, getting out in front of this bias that we have.
so you follow the money. And one of the things that you might want to Google is game theory. So you want to know who John Nash is or who von Neumann is, so that you can understand the idea of this, be the adversary, and map it out and see how this could go if you had it as a contest. Okay. One of the things that you do is you write a regular column for the Globe and Mail, and you've been writing for the Globe and Mail for over a decade now. And so you've been around the block and you've written a lot. Before we set this up, I pulled out a couple of articles that you've written in the past 4 or 5 months because I enjoyed them. And I thought this is a perfect opportunity to talk to you about them, because and some of the articles were actually written where you're talking about the research that was done in a paper that was released. So it's like you didn't do the research. All you're doing is you're bringing research to the public consciousness so that they can understand what's important and why. So the first was an article that you wrote back in June about 4 tricks to help people prevent knee-jerk reactions. And it was basically based on largely on some of the work of Daniel Kahneman in System 1 and System 2, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, and how a lot of people just make knee-jerk reactions when they read something in the press. But first off, what's your view on writing an investment policy statement?
So, the rationale as to why this is a part of the prescription is you're trying to get away from making decisions in the moment. You want to not be reactive. You want to be as proactive as you can. So there's a lot of research that shows that we make more optimal decisions in service of our future self when we make them in advance, because the present has a way of completely distorting trade-off choices in our mind. If you take a look at long-term trade-off choices, which all money decisions are, for example, saving for retirement, you chip away by putting a small amount of money into a portfolio, and over time you have this large pot of money down the road. And so on paper, it looks completely rational. A little bit of pain right now, foregone consumption, in exchange for a lot of pleasure, a lot of reward down the road. In our brains, it looks completely inverted, because anything that happens in the moment, in the present, is psychologically magnified. So the pain, even though it's small today on paper, is psychologically magnified to be very big. And the reward of that big pot of money down the road is psychologically minimized because it is not happening today. It's so far from the future and it's very abstract. So it's completely inverted as to what that emotional trade-off feels like compared to what it looks like on a spreadsheet. So in any case, if you have an investment policy statement, this allows you to predetermine before you hit rocky waters or what have you, what your general strategy is going to be. And because you have the benefit of time, you can really think about what these strategies are supposed to be. So for example, if the market is showing a lot of volatility, instead of not having a plan and trying to figure out what to do in the moment, you go back to this investment policy statement that says, yes, we've contemplated what happens because we know that this type of volatility happens once every 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever. And this is our game plan. And so it allows you to refer to something which has been developed while not under the threat of trying to make a short-term reaction.
Right. So some people call an investment policy statement a portfolio blueprint. They just sort of say, this is the plan, this is what we're going to do. And it involves the concept of pre-commitment. As you say, you put it in writing, you can execute it, you work on it with a professional, or you even do it by yourself. It's your commitment to yourself that this is when X happens, I will react by doing Y. So I have a story to tell about why I became a portfolio manager in 2009. And that is because of my experience in 2008 and 2009, where I had investment policy statements in place for every single client. We had it pre-signed off. This is what you're going to have a 60-40 mix, and we're going to rebalance back to 60-40. If stocks take a tumble, we're going to buy low and sell high. And what I learned was that despite my best efforts and despite my clients having signed off on the IPS, they didn't want to do that because it was contrary to their own, what you're saying, the psychology right now. It felt like it was painful to have to buy something that was dropping. And so ironically for me, one of the ways that I decided to deal with that problem, because it was extremely acute to my mind, it was very fresh in my mind, is to become a portfolio manager so that I could do the rebalancing without having to talk to my clients. Not because I don't want to talk to my clients, but because they will, with respect, because I love my clients, they will renege on their commitments because they just don't have the emotional bandwidth to deal with it all. So it's a bit of a plug for being a portfolio manager and being able to ethically exercise discretion for your clients, because you're trying to do what's best for them. And sometimes they're their own worst enemy.
Yeah. And, I think that actually perfectly ties into the second strategy I had in that comment column, which was to automate things, which is really about reducing decision points. And so if you, for example, engage with a portfolio manager, you've decided in advance that I want someone to sort of handle this according to a set of guidelines that we agree to, and then you let that person handle it, which is great because you've made that decision in advance. And so when you come to this point where you have a significant market downturn, because I think a lot of clients, let's say they have an investment policy statement, 5% down market, 10% down market, I think most of them are going to be like, okay, yeah, we'll stick to the plan. It's that they get really tested right when they need this plan the most. And that is when you have severe downturns. And so if you remove that decision point by having made that decision in advance to delegate to a portfolio manager, that is one of the benefits, I think, of that portfolio manager model, which again speaks to the benefits of automation, which was the second prescription in that column, which again is about reducing decision points, because every time you have the chance to make a decision, you have the chance to make an error. And that's what it's all about. To remove those decision points, you will therefore reduce the number of errors.
So the irony of that, of course, is that the podcast is called Make Better Wealth Decisions. And sometimes making the decision to not make decisions by making it all automated is the best decision you can make. Because if you recognize that you are prone to do things emotionally, then you might you might do some harm to your own portfolio, and you don't want to do that. Okay, so let's go on to the third thing, and that is using a checklist buddy. What is that?
Yeah, so this is really a version of wargaming, or being adversarial with yourself, getting someone to take the counterpoint and really trying to work through it. And when you do that, you might see things in a slightly different way. You might catch some things that you missed. We all have blind spots, myself included. And I still use professional advisors for different parts of my financial management as well. And I would argue that I probably know more than the average person. And I think that also comes down to knowing yourself. So I know that sometimes I am not as proactive with making decisions as I should be, leaving things to the last minute or what have you. That's just one of my traits. And so the best decision I can make is to delegate that to someone to address that weakness that I have. So even though I could do some of these things that I delegate to people, I choose to delegate because while I could do them, I don't do them sometimes, and that could be more costly.
Okay. And the last thing is respect the bell, and which is to say, even if markets are doing certain things, you can ignore it. So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, this was more because in my columns, I tried to address many different types of financial consumers, and there are a large number of people who are day trading. And one of the trends that we've seen in capital markets is that first we started with extended hours trading. Now we have overnight trading. And now with crypto, we have 24/7 trading. So there is no market bell for many types of things that people put their money into. And sometimes you need a pause. You need just like a cooling off period And we used to have that. It used to be much more delineated. The trading it was 9:30 to 4, and that's it. But as those trading hours have extended, and now you can trade in anything, and if you can't trade stocks, you can trade predictions in prediction markets 24/7. You don't have a chance to come up for air. So respecting the bell really means about putting in those pauses so that you can maybe look at things with a cooler, more refreshed head.
So in September, you wrote another article that I really enjoyed, and it's about overconfidence, but it was something that I'd never come to my attention. I'd never thought about it before. But you show there's empirical research that demonstrates that people are more inclined to be confident when they're with their decision, when they're given more information, even if that information is neutral. It doesn't necessarily reinforce where they were headed, but you're given information. The person has blue eyes. Well, okay, so I know more about the person. It's not going to help me make a better wealth decision. Can you tell me about that kind of research, and what does it tell you about human psychology that people will feel confident because they know more, even though what they know is in no way relevant to the decision they have to make?
Yeah, well, I think it was very fascinating research because I think a lot of people would assume that suboptimal decisions are often a product of people being overconfident. And there's tons of research that shows the impact of overconfidence on outcomes. It's bad. But what this paper is kind of saying is it's not just that people come in overconfident. It's the process of making decisions itself that creates more overconfidence. And so the researchers talked about something called the CIDC loop, which is the confidence, information distortion, confidence loop. And basically what they're saying is the act of making decisions in and of itself creates a distortion, which increases your bias. So they looked at a bunch of people and gave them these hypothetical investment decisions to make. And they had an initial position. Some people were bullish, some people were bearish. And then they presented them with a subsequent series of useless pieces of information that doesn't support or go against whether or not they should or shouldn't invest. Didn't really tell them anything useful. But every piece of information that they got increased their confidence level, their certainty in whatever their initial decision was. So if they were bullish to begin with, they became more bullish simply because they made a decision about this useless piece of information. But what else? Yeah, and what was even more interesting is that this created kind of a positive feedback loop in that now that you're more biased, the next piece of information creates a bigger distortion, which creates a even bigger increase in confidence on the next step. So more and more useless information, more and more confident about your choice, whatever your initial choice was. And again, whether you were bullish or bearish, you became more of either simply by going through the process of being given more useless information, which I thought was just a fascinating takeaway in that the process of decision making itself can create overconfidence. So this has ramifications in so many different aspects of our lives, but with respect to wealth management and making decisions about investing, again, we have so much exposure to online forums where a lot of people who may or may not know what they're talking about are giving opinions which are may or may not be useful. And so by exposing yourself in these communities and spending a lot of time, for example, Wall Street Bets, you think that you are becoming more knowledgeable when in fact you're just becoming more overconfident. You're not necessarily making better choices. You're just feeling more confident about the choices that you're making, and it's getting worse and worse, whether you're bullish or bearish. So I thought it was a fascinating paper.
And that's exactly why I wanted to talk to you about it, because I thought it was fascinating just reading your summary in the paper. So always a pleasure, Preet. I can probably count on two hands the number of people I've actually invited to be a repeat guest, and you're one of those. So that's already you're sort of in the pantheon of people that get to be a guest here. I want to end with the question that I always end with, which is, if it was up to you and you could make any recommendation to anyone with regard to making better wealth decisions, what singular piece of advice would you give to listeners to help them make better wealth decisions?
I would say if I would give people one piece of advice, it is to get a financial plan. When I say get a financial plan, I really talk about the financial planning process, because a financial plan in and of itself, that's not the end. In fact, I would say it's closer to the beginning of your relationship with making decisions about money. And so I know that you're a big advocate of financial planning. sitting down and really figuring out what matters to you. What do you want to achieve in life, and making sure that your money is being used in service of those goals, and then having a monitoring and review process. That is something that a lot of people do not recognize the value of. I think a lot of people, especially today in today's age, they think that financial advice and financial planning is synonymous with investments. It is a part of it. It is usually in service of an overall financial plan, but a financial plan is so much more encompassing. The financial planning process is so much more important, I would say, when it comes to actually achieving happiness and achieving the goals in your life. So look into financial planning and hopefully start that financial planning process. That's my number one piece of advice to people.
Thanks so much, Preet. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you, John.
This podcast is not to be construed as offering specific investment advice. Please consult a qualified advisor before acting. My books, Stand Up to the Financial Services Industry and Bullshift, are available online. If you'd like to meet to discuss how the topics in this podcast affect you directly, please visit my website.